Tonight, let's drift back in time. Not to the castles or kings, not to the myths or monarchs, but to the pounding rhythm of iron and fire, the glowing mouth of a forge, and the man standing before it, sweat running in rivulets down his soot-streaked face. Welcome to the world of the medieval blacksmith. And if this is your kind of quiet story, the kind that brings forgotten lives back to life and helps you drift into sleep through the rhythm of history, subscribe, leave a like, and settle in. You're exactly where you need to be. In most tales, blacksmiths are treated like background noise. A clank here, a hiss of steam there. They fix the hero's sword, maybe say something gruff and wise, then vanish behind the smoke. But the truth, being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was brutal, relentless, and profoundly lonely. Let's start with where you'd likely find him. Not in the bustling square beside the baker or the miller. No, he was almost always on the outskirts of the village. His forge stood alone, where the smoke wouldn't bother the other villagers, where the hammer's song wouldn't echo through the homes of those who still clung to silence and prayer. And that's where he stood, every day before dawn. Not because he was a morning person, but because the fire had to be fed, coaxed, tamed, before it could shape anything at all. The coals didn't care if you were tired. The bellows didn't care if your wrists ached, and the iron certainly didn't care that your hands were blistered and cracked. He would have woken in a single-room dwelling, no bigger than a stable stall. Maybe a wife slept beside him. Maybe not. Maybe he was widowed, or simply never married. It didn't matter. The morning began the same, dragging himself up, bones already aching, lighting the first fire of the day with fingers that barely bent. By the time the rest of the village stirred, his forge was already roaring. There were no gloves, no ear protection, no aprons like today's safety-rated ones, just rough leather, old cloth, and skin that had toughened over years of abuse. His arms bore the evidence, scars in strange, random patterns where the iron bit back. The first orders of the day were often the simplest. Nails, horseshoes, maybe a kitchen knife for the baker's wife. These didn't bring much coin, but they kept food on the table. Sometimes, the real money came from the lords, when it came at all. Axes, swords, armor fittings. But those orders were few and far between, and they came with expectations. The nobleman's steward wouldn't care if the smith was sick or hungry. He'd just want results, and every mistake cost something. Iron wasn't cheap. Time even less so. One misstrike, one overheat, and hours of work could be wasted. Sometimes the punishment wasn't lost time. It was a lash from a master, if the blacksmith was still apprenticed, or a lost client if he wasn't. Apprenticeships could begin as early as 7 years old. Imagine a boy, barely tall enough to reach the anvil, handed a set of tongs and told to hold glowing metal steady. One mistake, and he'd burn. One twitch, and the master's hammer could crush his fingers. No child labor laws, no second chances, just learning by doing and bleeding. Those who survived the early years grew calloused, not just in skin, but in spirit. Their arms thickened, their backs bent, their hearing dulled. By 30, many smiths looked 50. Their lungs were black with soot, their teeth chipped from grit and clenching, and they were always hot. Always. Even in winter, the forge blasted heat like a furnace from hell. Clothes stuck to their skin. They drank gallons of water and still felt dry. In summer, it was worse. Skin would blister from the inside out. Some fainted, some didn't wake back up, but perhaps the worst part was how invisible they were. People relied on the blacksmith every day. The horses needed shoes. The plows needed sharpening. The gates needed hinges, but no one thanked him. No one invited him to the feasts. The church warned of fire and brimstone, and looked suspiciously at the man who worked with both. There were whispers sometimes that the blacksmith spoke to the iron, that he understood fire too well, that his hammer was cursed. Superstition clung to him like the ash on his arms, and still he worked. Because what else was there? This was life. There was no promotion, no moving up, no retirement, just the next job, and the next. But despite the pain, despite the endless repetition, there was something sacred in the work. He could take raw ore and shape it into life. A tool, a weapon, a key. Every strike was an echo of purpose, every ember a piece of his will. And when the night fell and the forge cooled, he'd sit alone in the dim glow, hands stained black, shoulders slumped, watching the fire die, knowing it would all begin again in a few hours. But for now, just for a moment, there was silence. Before the blacksmith became a man of smoke and steel, he was a boy, and in the world he was born into, childhood was a brief, fragile thing. Imagine being 7, maybe 8. Your hands are still small, your bones still growing, your eyes not yet hardened by heat or cruelty. But you don't play. Not anymore. You're not at school. There's no school. You're standing beside a forge, squinting through smoke, holding a glowing bar of metal with tongs too big for your hands. And you're shaking, because your master just said, "Don't move." The hammer falls. Every heartbeat is a risk. The blow must strike the metal, not your fingers, but the old man wielding it isn't concerned. He doesn't check to see if you're afraid. He doesn't slow down for you. If you flinch, you might bleed. If you cry, you might be beaten. Because he, too, was once a trembling boy with burned fingers and a voice choked by fear. And no one stopped for him. Apprenticeship wasn't education. It was ownership. You lived in the smithy, slept near the embers, ate whatever scraps were left over. There was no wage. You were payment to your master from your parents, if they could afford it. If not, maybe the local lord paid for your placement, expecting a future discount. Or perhaps you were sent away as a burden, another mouth the family couldn't feed. The workday began in darkness. The forge had to be lit before the sun, the coals stirred and stoked. You learned quickly how to handle a bellows without tiring, how to sweep ash without choking. You carried buckets of water, fetched iron rods, prepared charcoal, mended broken tools, all before you were 10. You learned to hear metal, the sizzle of a hot bar dipped too soon, the ring of a flawed strike, the hiss of tempering gone wrong. Every tool had a name, every step a rhythm. You didn't write anything down. You remembered, or you were punished. You were never clean. Your fingernails turned gray and stayed that way. Your clothes smelled of sweat and soot. Your skin was always scraped or burned. The village boys might laugh or avoid you. Girls wrinkled their noses. No one admired the apprentice. You were just the dirty child in the shadows, the one who limped, the one who flinched at loud sounds. But slowly you grew. Muscles thickened, hands steadied. Fear faded into reflex. By 14, your hammer strikes had weight. Your eyes recognized good iron from bad. Your burns were fewer. The master stopped yelling as much, maybe even nodded once, and that nod, it meant everything. You began to take on small tasks, making nails, forming rivets, patching tools. When a customer came, you didn't speak, but you watched. Learned how the master handled barter, how he lied about the time something would take, how he inspected coins for weight and trickery. There was pride, too. Quiet and rough, but real. The first time you made something on your own. A knife, a latch, a small chisel. You couldn't stop looking at it, turning it in your hands even after your shift ended. You'd hidden your initials inside the tang, beneath the handle. No one would see them. But you knew. It was yours. Of course, the praise was fleeting. The master was quick to remind you that you were still learning, still replaceable. There were always more boys, and mistakes meant starting over, or worse, wasting precious materials. Iron wasn't cheap, and every failed piece was a loss. The forge itself became your second skin. You learned its moods, how it behaved in rain, how it sulked in wind. You could tell by the color of the coals if it was hot enough. You could feel it in your bones when the fire was dying. You learned to listen to silence. And the tools, oh, the tools. They weren't just instruments. They were extensions of your will. Tongs for bending, hammers for shaping, chisels for detail, files for precision. Each had weight, memory, balance. You cared for them like a priest tends his relics. You didn't lend them out. You didn't drop them. The days bled into years. Eventually, the master called you by name. Not boy, not you. Maybe he let you sign a piece. Maybe he sent you to handle a customer alone. That was trust. That was proof you'd survived. And then, one morning, he didn't wake up. It wasn't dramatic. He was just old, tired, and the fire in his chest finally went cold. You found him sitting beside the forge, head tilted back, eyes closed, as if he'd paused to rest and forgotten to rise. And the forge was yours. No ceremony, no inheritance, just ash, tools, and the knowledge that now everything was on your shoulders. Customers came. Work continued. But now you answered the door. Now you haggled over coin. Now you cursed when iron arrived late, when the weather ruined your tempering, when a blade cracked after hours of shaping. You thought it would feel like freedom, but it felt like weight. Because now every mistake was yours. Every burn, every flaw, every lost order. And there were many. Some days the iron refused to behave. Some days your hands shook. Some days your stomach growled so loud you couldn't hear your thoughts. But you kept going. Because you knew the rhythm. You knew the heat. You had grown into it like a vine into stone. Twisting, enduring, unyielding. This was your life now. There was no such thing as an ordinary day in a medieval blacksmith's life. Every morning began with the same ritual. Light the forge, stoke the coals, check the tools. But what came after was never guaranteed. There were always new orders, new problems, new aches in the same tired joints. Let's walk through a day. The forge is hot, always. Even in the depths of winter, snow piling outside the door, inside it is a furnace. You sweat through your tunic before the sun crests the hills. The fire glows orange, then white, then blue, hissing with life. You feed it with bellows and breath, coaxing it into readiness. You've long since lost your eyelashes from leaning too close. You stopped noticing the heat years ago. It's part of you now. The first customer arrives before breakfast, a farmer whose plowshare snapped on a rock. He grunts, says he needs it by midday. He'll pay in eggs and barley, not coin. You don't argue. You never argue. Coin is rare. Eggs will keep you fed. You set to work. Iron is hard, but not unyielding. It listens. If you strike it just right, at just the right heat. Too cold, and it cracks. Too hot, and it melts into ruin. You lift the hammer. Let it fall. Again. Again. Sparks fly. You don't flinch. They're nothing now, just light and sting. The anvil sings with every blow, a high metallic note that echoes off the walls. It's music to your ears, though it's taken your hearing by degrees. You strike in rhythm, a pattern learned over years. not just power, but control. Your body dances with the metal. Then comes the quenching, the moment of transformation. You plunge the shaped iron into water or oil. It hisses, screams, releases steam like a dying beast. The smell hits you. Burnt oil, scorched metal, sweat. You don't notice anymore. By midday, your arms throb. You eat standing up, if at all. Maybe a crust of bread, a cold onion, a swallow of ale. Then back to work. The next order is more delicate. A set of hinges for the church's front door. They want them ornate, symmetrical, with curls and floral flourishes. You don't ask why. You never do. You just draw the design in ash on the workbench and begin. You heat, twist, fold, tap. The details are slow, unforgiving. One mistake ruins the pattern. The priest will inspect it closely. He'll judge with the authority of God, but he won't pay. The church never pays. Later comes a repair, a broken scythe blade. The man brings it in wrapped in rags like a wound. He watches as you work, hovering too close. You can feel his eyes, his doubt. He thinks he knows better. You ignore him. Let your hands speak. Your back aches now. Your thumbs split at the nail. You burned your wrist when the tongs slipped, but there's no time to bind it. You wrap it in a rag and keep going. There's always something next. Then come the moments you dread, when the Lord's steward appears. He doesn't knock. He walks in like he owns the place, because in a way he does. He brings orders, not requests. Nails for the stable, chain links for the gate, armor repairs, sometimes a sword or spear tip. He wants them perfect. He wants them yesterday. He reminds you that you owe rent for the land your forge stands on. He doesn't offer coin. He offers protection if you comply. You say yes. Of course you say yes. You do not cross the steward. The work shifts with the seasons. Spring brings tools. Summer brings weapons. Autumn brings repairs. Winter is the hardest. No metal flows right in the cold, and coal burns too fast. Your hands crack from the dryness. Your toes stay numb. Some mornings, the forge won't light at all. You sit there in the dark, blowing on dying coals, begging them to live. And through it all, the tools are your lifeline. The hammer, your voice. It speaks to the metal when words fail. The tongs, your fingers. They reach into fire where flesh cannot go. The anvil, your anchor. The heart of your world. Unchanging, eternal. You clean them daily, oil the handles, keep them sharp. When one breaks, it's like losing a friend. By evening, you're covered in grime. Your face is streaked, your tunic stiff with sweat. You sit on a stool near the cooling forge, watching the embers fade. Sometimes someone brings a bottle of cheap wine. Sometimes you share a laugh with another tradesman. But often it's just silence. The kind of silence that hums behind your eyes and settles deep in your bones. And even then, you're not done. There are ledgers to mark. Who owes what? What orders remain? There's the anvil to brush clean. The tools to place back in their rightful positions. You don't leave them scattered. That's disrespect. That invites rust, decay, loss. Your hands tremble now. Not from fear, but from fatigue so deep it feels like sleep while awake. You walk home, or what passes for home. A room, a shed, maybe just a cot near the forge. You fall onto the bed, not bothering to wash. There's no point. Tomorrow it begins again, and no one will thank you. The village will wake, its gates swinging smoothly. The farmers will work, their tools sharp. The children will chase hoops with iron rings. The guards will grip swords that gleam. The church door will creak open, welcoming prayers, and none of them will think about you, because the blacksmith is a shadow, essential, invisible, endless. It is easy to assume that the blacksmith, standing at the center of so much, of tools, of trade, of war, must have held a respected place in the village. And on paper, perhaps he did. His work was essential. No one questioned that, but essential didn't mean honored, it didn't mean welcomed, and it certainly didn't mean understood. His forge stood slightly apart from the village, and not just because of the smoke. There was something deeper, something superstitious. Fire was sacred and dangerous. Iron, too, carried a strange weight in the minds of medieval folk. The blacksmith, they believed, worked with elements too raw, too close to the edge of the divine. He could make a sword, yes, but could he unmake it? Could he bend more than metal? Whispers followed him. Children were told not to look into the forge, lest they go blind. Women made the sign of the cross if he walked too close. Some said he spoke to the flames. Some said he spoke to things darker. But no one ever said these things to his face. They needed him, yet they did not want him. He was welcome when their tools broke, when the harvest needed new plows, when a thief had to be shackled. But at the feast, at the wedding, he sat alone if he came at all. And often he didn't. Even the church kept its distance. You'd think a man who made hinges for the chapel, who repaired iron candlesticks, who forged crosses and grates and bells, would be embraced by the clergy. But fire was always suspect, too close to hell, and the fact that the blacksmith created, that he brought form from chaos, made some priests uneasy. Only God creates, they whispered. What does that make him? He paid his tithes like everyone else, but he was rarely seen kneeling in a pew. And when he did come to service, people shifted away. No one wanted to share the bench with the man who smelled like ash and lightning. But he understood. The forge had taught him many things, and isolation was one of them. He lived alone more often than not, or with a dog, or a cat if he was lucky. Maybe a boy apprentice, quiet and thin and full of burns. The kind of boy who wouldn't ask too many questions, who wouldn't try to leave after dark, because no one walked near the forge at night. And still the blacksmith watched the world turn. He saw children grow, couples wed, old men die. He made the nails for their coffins, even as he remembered making the hinges for their cradles. He listened to gossip not as a participant, but as a wall. Stories came to him, not for his opinion, but because he was present, always there, like stone, like the anvil. But every now and then, someone would stop and look. A girl, maybe. A widow. Someone with eyes that weren't afraid. And for a brief time, the blacksmith would dream. Of a shared bed, of warm bread, of laughter not heard from a distance but from beside him. Those dreams rarely lasted. A blacksmith's hands were not gentle. His days were long. His income unpredictable. He could not offer gold or land or rank, only fire, only steel, only the surety that he would endure. And that, for many, was not enough. So he buried the hope, like he buried his father, like he buried his first apprentice when the tongs slipped and the iron struck too high. A grave dug by hand at the edge of the woods, marked with a simple iron cross. He had forged it himself, each stroke a prayer he didn't know how to say aloud. The years wore on. He learned the rhythms of silence. He knew when the birds fell quiet, a storm was coming. He knew which horses limped before their owners did. He could smell rust before it showed. His world was not made of words. It was made of temperature, of tension, of weight. He did not think of himself as wise, but others did. They came to him with questions sometimes, not of iron, but of life. "Will this hold?" they asked, showing him a broken blade or a fraying chain. And he'd answer, slowly, "For a while." They nodded. That was enough. The blacksmith didn't lie. He didn't flatter. He didn't pretend. He gave people what they needed, even if it wasn't what they wanted. And in that, he became more than a tradesman. He became a kind of monument. Still, the loneliness clung to him. Not like a blanket, more like a second skin. There were nights when the forge was cold, when the coals refused to catch, when the snow piled outside and the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, when the only sound was his breath. And in those moments he wondered, will anyone remember me? He had no paintings, no letters, no heirs, just tools and metal and fire. But perhaps that was enough, because for every hinge that creaked open a door, for every plow that turned the soil, for every sword that swung in defense of the helpless, there was his hand behind it, invisible, but real. There was one force that could change the rhythm of a blacksmith's life in a heartbeat. War. When war came, everything shifted. The forge that once echoed with the making of tools now rang with the urgency of weapons. Orders came not from farmers or villagers, but from knights, from stewards, from men in colors the blacksmith didn't recognize. There were no pleasantries, no bargaining, only demands. 10 swords, 3 days. Fit this armor, now. The Lord wants pikeheads by sundown. The blacksmith didn't argue. He just worked. The air grew thicker with smoke, the days longer. There were no nights anymore, only brief pauses between strikes. Apprentices ran barefoot, carrying blades to be cooled, axes to be honed. Sparks danced through the dark like fireflies, but there was no beauty in them now. The war meant coin, yes, more than usual, but it came with a cost. He forged weapons for boys younger than his first apprentice. He watched them ride away with blades he had shaped, edges he had sharpened. Sometimes he saw them return. Sometimes he didn't. He never asked their names. There was a rule among smiths. You don't look too long into the eyes of the man who will use what you made. Not when it's a sword. Not when it's for killing. The metal doesn't ask why. Neither does the fire. The smith learns to do the same. But he felt it. Every time he hammered a blade into shape, he knew what it would do. He could see the notch it would leave in armor, the weight with which it would crush bone, the scream it would pull from a man's mouth. And still he worked, because war didn't wait. When the battlefield came closer, when smoke rose not from forges but from burning farms, the blacksmith locked his tools away. He buried iron beneath the floorboards. Some blacksmiths fled, others stayed. Some were pressed into service, forced to follow the army and repair gear on the march. That was a different kind of hell. The mobile forge was a creaking cart, barely stable, pulled by a mule that feared fire. The road was mud, the rain constant. He worked beside corpses, in trenches, surrounded by moans and silence. There was no shop, no roof, just sky and steel. He learned to patch armor with nails, to reforge broken blades with scavenged iron, to temper in blood when water ran out. And when the fighting paused, soldiers came to him not just with weapons, but with needs: a new buckle, a sharpened knife, a chain to bind a prisoner. They didn't ask if he wanted to do it, they just gave him the metal. And he did what he always had. He shaped it. One day, a knight brought him a shattered sword. "This belonged to my father," he said. "Fix it." The blacksmith looked at the blade. It was too far gone. Cracks like veins ran through it. The hilt was split, the tang warped. He said so. The knight drew his dagger. I said, "Fix it." So he did. He used another blade, one he'd been saving. He carved the initials into the new hilt, matched the weight, polished it until it gleamed. The knight never knew the difference. But the blacksmith remembered. War taught him that nothing was permanent. Not steel, not loyalty, not memory. And when the battles ended, when peace came crawling back on bloodied knees, the blacksmith returned home, or what was left of home. Maybe his forge was still standing, maybe it wasn't. Maybe the village remembered him. Maybe they'd all changed. Either way, he rebuilt. Stone by stone, beam by beam, fire by fire. He set his anvil back in place, cleaned the rust from his tools, waited for the first knock on the door. It came as it always did, a broken gate, a bent scythe, life resuming piece by piece. But the blacksmith was not the same. He dreamed differently now, not of iron or flame, but of eyes he'd never see again, of names never spoken, of swords buried in fields, marking the spots where boys had fallen. He no longer took joy in the shaping of blades. His hammer still struck true, but slower. He worked more with farming tools, less with weapons. When asked for a sword, he hesitated. Then he'd nod, quietly, because he was a smith. That's what he did. And in the quiet hours, when the forge cooled and the world slept, he sometimes ran his fingers over old blades. Not to admire the work, but to remember the weight. Not of the metal, but of the choice. The years pass whether you ask them to or not. A blacksmith doesn't measure time in seasons or birthdays. He measures it in tools worn smooth by use, in grooves on the hammer's handle, in how long it takes for his knees to stop hurting each morning, and in how often he finds himself staring at the fire, not thinking, just remembering. There were good moments, there had to be. The day a child brought him a drawing of a sword, all crooked lines and impossible curves, and said, "Make this for me someday." The time a woman brought a broken brooch that belonged to her mother, and he fixed it, just so, and she wept when he handed it back. The night he made music, yes, music, on the anvil for a passing minstrel, and they shared wine and silence until the stars began to fade. But most days were repetition, the same tools, the same movements, the same sounds. He grew slower, not weaker, just more deliberate. The rush left him. He no longer raced to finish a blade in an afternoon. He took his time. Let the metal speak. He could sense things now that he never noticed before. How a sword's balance shifted with even a sliver of weight at the hilt. How horseshoes wore differently depending on soil and stride. How each type of iron had its own voice, some deep and sullen, some high and bright. He taught less, not for lack of knowledge, but because few came to learn. The world was changing. New trades were rising. Mills, merchants, glassmakers. Some villages brought in foreign goods, cheaper, shinier, easier to sell. The blacksmith remained, unmoved, unchanged. He watched his own hands with something like detachment. The scars had faded into one another, a map with no borders. His fingers bent a little less. His grip was no longer unbreakable. But his will, that stayed. He'd seen apprentices come and go. Some left for cities. One joined the army and never returned. A few stayed, long enough to call him master, long enough to become their own men. He didn't stop them. He understood that the forge was not a place everyone could live their whole life beside. It demanded too much, took more than it gave. But for those who stayed, it gave them something strange and rare. Clarity. You couldn't lie at the anvil. You couldn't cheat a fire. You either shaped the metal, or it broke you. And some days the blacksmith felt broken, not just in body, but in spirit. He'd seen too much, lost too much. His sleep was lighter now, his dreams more vivid, not of war or pain, but of silence, of the forge cold, the tools untouched, the door closed. Was that coming soon? There was no retirement for a blacksmith, no pension, no farewell. You worked until you couldn't. Then someone else took the hammer, or they didn't. Sometimes he wondered what legacy he'd leave. Not wealth, he had none. Not a name. No one spoke it much anymore. Just the tools, the forge, and maybe, if he was lucky, a few pieces still out there in the world. A gate that still opened, a horseshoe still nailed firm, a blade passed down from father to son. That would be enough. His family, if he had any, were distant. Cousins he barely knew. Maybe a child once, a long time ago, whose mother had left. He didn't speak of it. The forge didn't allow space for regrets. But sometimes, when the night was long and the coals low, he would sit in the quiet and hum a lullaby. One he hadn't heard since he was a boy. One his mother had sung before the fire took her. And in those moments he wasn't a blacksmith. He was just a man. Tired. Alone. Still alive. It always ended the same way. Not with a clang or a roar, but with quiet. One morning the forge didn't light. The blacksmith sat before it, tools laid out as always, kindling in hand. But the flame didn't catch. The wood was dry, the bellows full, the coal piled neat, but something in him refused to spark. So he didn't force it. He sat there in the silence, hands resting on his knees, listening not for the whistle of heat or the rhythm of metal, but for something else. Something he hadn't heard in years. Stillness. He looked around the forge, the walls dark with soot, but solid. The tools, each one placed just so. The anvil, his oldest companion, shining softly in the pale light of dawn. Dust floated through the beams like slow-falling snow. He watched it dance. There was no sadness, no regret, just an overwhelming sense of completion. He had shaped iron for 50 years, maybe more. He had buried friends, outlived enemies, forged for kings, for criminals, for children yet unborn. And now his hands shook when lifting the hammer, not with fear, but age. His knees cracked when he stood. His breath came slower. He no longer dreamed of the forge. He dreamed of rivers, of green fields, of cool wind and nothing burning. He rose slowly, walked to the anvil, and placed the hammer down. Not dropped, not tossed, but placed, like laying a body to rest, and then he left. There was no one to stop him, no one to ask why. Some thought he had died. Others assumed he had gone to live with family far away. No one searched. No one needed to. The forge stayed locked, the tools untouched. Children would creep by, daring one another to peer through the slats. That's where the Iron Priest lived, they whispered. He made swords with names, could talk to fire. Some claimed they heard footsteps inside at night. Some said the anvil rang once on the first frost of winter. Others said nothing at all. Years passed, then decades. The forge began to lean, just slightly. The roof sagged in one corner. Vines crept up the walls. Dust thickened. And then, one day, someone returned. A boy, nearly grown, carrying a hammer wrapped in cloth. His father's, he said, or maybe his grandfather's. He unlocked the door, stepped into the dark, lit the fire, and the forge breathed again. The dust didn't matter. The sagging roof didn't matter. The tools were still there. The anvil still rang. The fire still listened. Because that was the truth the old blacksmith had always known. Iron remembers. fire forgives, and every end is only the start of someone else's beginning. If you're still with me, if your eyes are closing now and your thoughts are drifting, I hope this story brought you peace. And if it did, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or letting me know where you're listening from. It means more than you know. Sleep well, and remember, somewhere the fire still burns.